Hello, I'm Matthew McKenna, and this is my final project for the criminal justice course at Lynn Benton. And I've chosen to do my project on Theodore Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber. For the presentation of the case, Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber, killed 3 and injured 23 individuals over the course of a 17-year nationwide mail bombing campaign. Kaczynski was a mathematics prodigy who graduated from Harvard, but quit his job as a mathematics professor to live a primitive life in the wilderness of Montana. His victims ranged from airline passengers caught in the crossfire to scientists working to advance technology. In court, Kaczynski was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. So when we look at applying criminal theories, the first one, especially the psychological component of it, brought me to the frustration aggression angle. Kaczynski, frustrated during his time teaching at Harvard, ditched a future forward life altogether and lived off the grid in the wilderness of Montana. He hated where he saw the future heading, especially with technology, and wanted to stop it at any cost. He blamed technology for causing widespread psychological suffering and a destabilizing effect on society as a whole. When we look towards the sociological aspect, I chose strain theory. This is also the prevailing theory that the FBI themselves looked to as a main point in this case. The industrial society is what Kaczynski was fighting against. He believed that being, quote, plugged in with technology was an evil of the world. He saw people accept new technology as positive without thinking about the consequences of it being created or further developed, and believed that it eroded a human's freedom and autonomy. He was fighting on behalf of those he thought got tricked into accepting technological advancement without reason. He was the hero of the story in his eyes. For biological, it was a little bit harder, especially because although we have lots of interviews with him and a insurmountable number of documentation and papers that he wrote himself, we know that he was depressed. We know that he was mentally ill. But being one of the two options, serotonin or testosterone, as a possible fuel for his criminal behaviors, I opted to go with serotonin. Mostly for the reason that when you believe you're fighting the greatest evil the world has ever seen, and you're the only one who can make people see the truth, that's a powerful feeling. Serotonin is released when you participate in motor function. For the most part, this tends to be exercise. And if you have a deficiency in serotonin, this can lead to things like depression, anxiety, especially acts of aggression. Things like he quit his job, he moved to Montana to live in the wilderness in a shack disconnected from technology, and he found an outlet that, in theory, not practice, cured him of a lot of his ailments to an extent. Kaczynski knew how to handle himself in the wilderness, but he definitely didn't have a bench press at his bomb shack. Alongside, he was the fact that he was the most wanted man in America. He didn't have the luxury of going outside very often, especially considering the manhunt across the country and the fact that he lived in the wilderness to escape and evade authorities. So there was definitely not a lot of time to work towards a more realistic cure and increase those serotonin levels. Was his violence a rational response? For the rationalization of the bombings, Kaczynski bombed in the name of freedom and autonomy, two core American values. He believed that succumbing to the technological advancements of the world would lead to the destruction of humanity. He did not need to rationalize the bombings, Rather, he believed that his bombings were the only rational way to send his message. He didn't believe people were hearing him. He didn't get his message across. We've seen from evidence he sent a 40,000 uh, letter manifesto to the New York Times and the Washington Post. He wanted his message to be heard, and he felt that this was the way to get that message heard. In terms of the criminal thinking errors, um, again, he is a prodigy. He was the height of his field. So a lot of the criminal thinking errors don't necessarily apply to him as they would a more crime of passion or a small planned act of aggression. But the ones that I thought did connect the best to him were first lonerism. Although Kaczynski used the word we throughout his writings as a term of trying to make it seem like it was a group behind the bombings as opposed to a single person. From very early on, the FBI felt that he was a loner and that it was unlikely he was in a relationship. And if he was in a relationship, that it was distant, maybe even physically. The second would be closed channel. Kaczynski was a very secretive man, so much so that he built a shack in the woods. And although he wrote letter after letter, he never once changed his tune on just about anything. And because he didn't like technology, he would often read the newspaper for information on his attack successes or failures. With no TV, he'd be avoiding any alternate thinking that others may provide on live television to his attacks. He was kind of his own echo chamber in that sense. The third was pride. As a highly distinguished mathematical scholar, Kaczynski knew he was the smartest man in whatever room his bombs were in. He was proud of his bombs. They never left any evidence and were almost never caught until they were opened on arrival. He was never worried about being caught because he didn't believe he could be. He was just too methodical. He took a lot of pride and even so showed that in his writings. For the types of crimes, although Kaczynski did a lot more than just murder, it is the only criminal act we covered that fits under the umbrella of his case. He was charged with 13 counts of transporting explosive devices with the intent to kill. But even though Kaczynski murdered 3 people, he was offered a plea deal that was instead those 13 counts of transporting. None of these counts included the murders. This was done in order to secure a fast sentencing process, but by proxy, since he was not federally charged for murder and was instead federally charged with 13 counts of transporting, double jeopardy laws meant that both New Jersey and California, where 2 of the 3 murders took place, could not charge him with federal murder because you can't. Double jeopardy laws state that if you are charged during a case for the crimes and you are sentenced for those crimes, that case without new evidence or an insurmountable amount of essentially screw ups on the legal system would not be allowed to open back up that case and add additional charges on top of this. So to this day, even though we have proof and confessions on video and in writing that Ted Kaczynski murdered 3 individuals, he was never actually found guilty of murder in a court of law. In efforts to prevent crimes like this, since the case of the Unabomber, almost nothing has changed regarding rules and regulations following the fallout of the Unabomber's tirade. Kaczynski was so professional. He was truly a 1 in a million case, according to the FBI. Everything from the types of bombs he made to the way he made them, even going as far as to carve the wrong initials into his bombs, including waiting months or years between mailing his bombs, meant that without his family giving a tip to the FBI, he likely would have never been found. There's really no way to prevent this from happening. You could X-ray scan suspicious packages that come through the mail, I suppose, but the whole point is that these packages were not suspicious. They looked, felt, and to all extents were normal packages until they arrived on your doorstep to be opened. His whole point was to show that technological advancement wasn't always good, and he took advantage of the technological advancements in society that people had accepted without cause, and showed them that it could be used for nefarious intents. So even though there's not much to be done specifically to prevent what the Unabomber had done, things like the Patriot Act and other information forward investigative projects that the FBI and CIA have developed could allow us to prevent attacks like this again in the future. But even so, Kaczynski acted alone and without connection to technology. So even illegally tapping his entire family's phones, internet, security systems would not have gotten anything, let alone waiting for him to send an email with some, hot-lined keywords in it. It just wouldn't happen. I don't think that even today, with the level of professionalism and sophistication Kaczynski had and maintained for over a decade, we'd be able to catch him if it happened again. There's realistically nothing the FBI could have done besides sit next to the tip line and pray. When it comes to the societal costs of the crime, we have to look at first the lives taken and the lives shortened by these attacks. Kaczynski took 3 lives and injured 23 more. While it's unknown how many of the 23 injured individuals had their lifespan shortened, without a doubt, I can say the quality of their lives were degraded. Not only was each individual's quality of life degraded, but those related to them and surrounding them in their social circles are degraded. Victims of attacks, especially those that cause irreversible damage, often find friends and family become very distant due to the extra care and attention required by the victim to recover and continue on their life's path. This, alongside other difficulties victims of attack experience, can lead to many victims committing suicide, which then furthers damage those around them, especially the ones who stayed close after the initial attack. In terms of financial cost, as a medical malpractice lawyer, my dad has to find the value of debilitating conditions and injuries on a regular basis. As many of Kaczynski's victims were highly educated or even executive officers in corporations, in lost salary alone, you'd be looking at $500,000 to a few $1,000,000 for each victim injured and unable to work at the capacity that they previously could. That's before getting into medical bills, future medical expenses, and changes in lifestyle like colostomy bags, skin transplants, and scarring that could affect future income and stability of one's life. The monetary value of the damage done by Kaczynski is too much to calculate, and even then impossible to calculate. Each case would have to be on a case-by-case basis, adding up the value. And to this day, beyond black market value, we truly don't have an average value of a human life when it comes to medical malpractice, which is realistically the only place in the legal system where you would find a more exact value on body parts, livelihood, stuff like that. So when we look at what new prevention strategies could be established in order to prevent or slow another event like this happening, it's not necessarily new, but it's going to be a lot more of a new spin on it. When you look at the airport, you hear on the overhead, you hear on the radios, you see flyers, posters in the airport, see something, say something. If you see a bag left alone, if you see someone doing something suspicious, see something, say something. This was developed after the 9/11 terrorist attack and has been estimated to stop at least a few dozen attacks on airports and other public spaces. These usually aren't large acts of sophisticated group domestic terrorism, but things like an individual with a gun intending to harm people, or definitely bombs have been found, especially in trash cans or inside or outside of airport bathrooms. And so it's an effective strategy when it comes to smaller areas. But when you're looking at spreading that to people you know and love, especially family members, spouses, close friends, it becomes a lot harder to, as the kids say, narc on your friend if you see something suspicious or hear something suspicious from them. I don't think that any laws or policies introduced anywhere could have stopped Kaczynski from his bombings before it started. but he suffered from schizophrenia and other related mental health problems. Alongside his mental health problems, he carried his beliefs all of his life, and like I said, never really changed his tune. This means that those around him may have noticed some things were off about him from time to time, beyond the normal, I guess. But he was also a mathematical prodigy from childhood. He was from the start different than everybody else, and so could have very easily been written off as the weird kid, the smart kid, the nerd. And he's different than other people already. This is not suspicious or something I should take to the local authorities. But if somebody heard him say something like, he wanted to act out violence or respond to something in a way that made them feel like this person was going to do something illegal or dangerous, they could always put in a tip with the authorities. Obviously, this would be the ideal situation, but as we know in America, school shooters and domestic abusers with history of diagnosed mental health issues and previous criminal or violent offenses are not stopped, even when a tip does come through the proper channels and authorities are aware of what's happening. But if we were to effectively employ this strategy and convince others that narking out your friend or family member is better for the greater good, we may never have to see another Unabomber. But the only way to prevent this is, having those capabilities of hearing something on a tip line and taking it seriously. To end, this is a quote from Ted Kaczynski himself in his 40,000 letter manifesto that he'd sent out. The concept of, quote, mental health in our society is defined largely by the extent to which an individual behaves in accord with the needs of the system and does so without showing signs of stress. Thank you.